Leland Cray didn't just take my system, he turned 12 years of my work into a public spectacle, then handed it to his nephew like it was a toy. The platform I built processed over $1.2 billion a year. By the end of that week, he would realize he hadn't replaced me. He had exposed himself. But in that moment, standing in that room, all I felt was the quiet, precise weight of humiliation. My name is Iris Lane, lead systems architect. I designed the core infrastructure that kept this company alive, stable and legally untouchable. Leland Cray, the new CEO. Obsessed with speed, addicted to disruption, the kind of man who calls recklessness vision. With fresh perspective, he announced, smiling like this was progress. He turned to Noah Cray, his nephew. 3 weeks in the company. Applause followed. Not belief. Survival. Then Noah opened his laptop and started a live stream. Today we're taking over legacy architecture. The first slide appeared. My name, my system, labeled as the problem. A few people laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Enough to be heard. Enough to stay. I didn't defend myself, didn't interrupt, didn't react. I just nodded. Understood. 3 minutes later, my resignation was submitted. Leland didn't even look at me when I walked out. That was fine, because they thought they had removed me from the system. What they didn't realize was that the system was never just theirs. They didn't fire me. They disconnected themselves. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime. I stepped into the lobby, calm, steady. As I pushed the glass door open, my badge flickered red, access revoked mid-step. For the first time that day, I smiled. I truly appreciate you taking the time to be here. If you found this story touching, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It's completely free. I'm also curious where you're listening from, what the temperature is there right now, and I'll read all the comments. What follows contains fictional elements and is supported by artificial intelligence to highlight the human message and emotional experience. Hopefully you'll find something for yourself. If not, stay healthy, and we'll see each other again later. The quiet didn't hit me all at once. It settled in like a system stabilizing after a surge. I sat at my kitchen table the morning after I resigned, coffee untouched, replaying the architecture in my head, the way I always did when something felt off. 12 years. That's how long it took to build something they could misunderstand in under 12 minutes. There was a night 3 years ago when the system almost collapsed under a corrupted data migration. 47 million records on the edge of disappearing. I stayed for 30 hours straight, rewriting recovery scripts line by line, until the numbers aligned again. No announcement, no applause. Just a quiet note in the log: integrity restored. Later, I redesigned the entire validation flow. Reduced system error rates to 0.02%. Not because anyone asked, but because that's what stability looks like when you care about consequences. Leland Cray never cared about consequences. He cared about momentum, optics, headlines. Once he tried to push an untested deployment before a major client audit. I told him no, not loudly, just clearly. He stared at me like I had insulted him personally. Yesterday, he finally said it out loud. An internal email went out an hour after I left. We're finally removing bottlenecks. I read it twice. Then I closed it. No anger, no surprise. Just clarity. Because what they called a bottleneck was the only thing that had been holding the system together. And buried deep in that same system, quiet, documented, and fully compliant, was a small line most people never noticed. An external audit visibility layer. I built it myself. Not to stop failure, just to make sure it could never be hidden. Stillness has a way of sharpening things you used to ignore. By the second day after I left, the silence in my apartment felt less like absence and more like signal. No meetings, no interruptions. Just the system still running, still breathing, visible through the partner-facing API endpoints I had designed years ago for external transparency. I didn't need internal access. I never had. I opened the logs the same way I always did, not looking for failure, but for pattern drift. The timestamps lined up cleanly. Throughput looked healthy. Latency was even slightly improved. On the surface, everything was exactly what Leland Cray wanted: faster, lighter, unconstrained. Then I saw it. A sequence of transactions flagged with a subtle marker. Not an error. Not a warning. Just a deviation. I leaned forward, scrolling back. Validation checkpoints skipped. Not broken. Not removed. Bypassed. Noah. He wasn't crashing the system. He was stepping around it like someone walking through a building, by ignoring the doors and climbing through open windows instead. Inefficient in the long term. Dangerous in ways that don't show up immediately. I traced the behavior across multiple sessions. Same pattern, same confidence, same disregard. See, we don't need all these redundant checks. I could almost hear his voice from the livestream replay. I didn't react. I reconstructed. Because the system I built was never designed to stop people like him. It was designed to observe them. Years ago, after the 47 million record incident, I made a decision I never announced. Blocking errors wasn't enough. Prevention assumes competence, and competence I had learned was not guaranteed. So I added something quieter. A layer that didn't interrupt, didn't alert, didn't protect. It watched. Every deviation from expected behavior, every skipped validation, every forced override, every optimization that bent the rules was recorded not as failure, but as narrative, context, intent, behavioral deviation mapping. Most engineers would call it over-engineering. Leland would call it unnecessary friction. But I knew better. Systems don't fail because of code. They fail because of people who believe they understand it faster than they actually do. I followed the trail deeper. Each action Noah took was being mirrored, reconstructed into structured reports. Clean, readable, undeniable. Not just what changed, but how, and more importantly, why it mattered. Still no alerts triggered. Still no system instability. Just truth accumulating quietly. That's when I checked the module registry. Not the company's registry. Mine. There it was. The layer everyone ignored because it never got in their way. External audit visibility layer. Status active. License personal. I exhaled slowly. Of course they didn't remove it. They couldn't. Because technically it wasn't theirs to remove. I had written it under a personal license agreement years ago, back when the company needed rapid deployment and I needed legal protection. It was easier at the time. Faster approvals, less paperwork. No one questioned it, until now. When I resigned, the license didn't terminate. It shifted. Observer mode, no control, no interference, just visibility. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet settling in again, but different now. Not empty, not passive, precise. Because at this point, nothing needed to be stopped, nothing needed to be fixed. The system was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was telling the truth. And for the first time since I walked out of that building, I understood something with complete clarity. They thought removing me would give them control. What it actually did was remove the only person who could choose not to look. Now the system would keep watching. And eventually, so would everyone else. Irony has a clean, precise edge when you recognize it in real time. I was watching a system designed for stability become a stage for improvisation, and the person performing didn't even realize the audience extended far beyond the room. Noah had scheduled another live stream, this time labeled Real-Time Optimization Session. The title alone told me everything I needed to know. I pulled up the partner-facing feed and synced it with the public system logs. 2 windows. Same truth, different formats. Noah appeared on screen, confident, relaxed, narrating each step like he was hosting a product demo instead of modifying a live financial pipeline. "We're going to simplify some of the legacy constraints," he said, smiling at the comments scrolling beside his feed. "Make things more efficient." Efficient. I watched his cursor hover over the validation layer I had written years ago. Not a complicated piece of code, just disciplined. It forced the system to pause, to confirm, to respect the order of operations. It was never about slowing things down. It was about making sure nothing moved faster than it could be understood. He disabled it, not removed. Just bypassed. We don't need all these paranoid checks. The chat reacted immediately, applause emojis, quick affirmations, the digital equivalent of nodding heads. Momentum loves an audience. I didn't move, didn't open my keyboard, didn't even breathe differently, because what I was watching wasn't failure, not yet. It was deviation, clean, measurable, and quietly recorded. The transactions began to flow faster. Latency dropped by a few milliseconds. Throughput ticked upward. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd call it improvement. But I knew where to look. I traced the sequence paths, comparing them to the expected behavioral maps stored in the system. The differences were subtle at first. A skipped verification here, a reordered dependency there. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would trigger alarms. That was the point. Noah leaned closer to the camera. See, nothing broke. Of course nothing broke. Not immediately. Systems like this don't collapse on impact. They unravel under pressure. I followed the logs deeper, watching as the first layer of deviation markers began to cluster. Still no errors, still no warnings. Just a growing pattern of decisions that assumed the system would behave the way he expected it to. That assumption was always the risk. And then, quietly, something shifted. The logs didn't just record the actions anymore. They began to describe them. I noticed it in a new field appended to the event stream. At first glance, it looked like extended metadata. But when I expanded it, the structure was different. It wasn't just data, it was context. Each deviation was being reconstructed into a readable sequence. Not code-level detail, but behavioral framing. What changed, how it changed, and the inferred intent behind it. Narrative. I felt the tension settle into something colder. The system wasn't just watching anymore. It was explaining. I leaned back slightly, letting the realization land fully before I moved again. This wasn't something I had actively triggered. It was the natural progression of the layer I had built, designed to evolve from observation into interpretation once deviation crossed a certain threshold. No alerts, no interruptions, just a record that could be understood by people who weren't engineers. Noah kept talking unaware. "We're cutting out unnecessary friction," he said. "This is how you scale." Behind him, the system was writing a different story. One that didn't argue, didn't accuse, didn't react. It simply documented. I watched as the first complete narrative block finalized in the log stream, clean and structured, ready for export. Not sent yet, not exposed, just waiting. Controlled, contained. And for the first time since the live stream started, I allowed myself a small, steady exhale. Because now it wasn't about whether the system would fail. It was about when the truth would become visible and to whom. If you think Noah bypassing validation and rewriting a live production system on a live stream is going to end badly, drop a 1 in the comments. Because what looks like confidence right now is already being recorded as something else entirely. The first signal didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with timing. Exactly 24 hours after Noah's livestream, I noticed a subtle change in the outbound traffic patterns exposed through the partner API. Not volume, not frequency, direction. 3 external endpoints, long-term partners tied directly to high-value transaction flows, received structured data packets at precisely staggered intervals. No internal alerts triggered, no escalation emails circulated. Inside the company, everything was still quiet. I opened the transmission logs and followed the path outward. The packets weren't raw exports. They were compiled reports, clean, formatted, intentionally readable. Not for engineers, for decision makers. I already knew what I would find. Still, I reviewed the first one in full. It began with a time-stamped summary of the livestream session. Then, a reconstructed sequence of actions validation layers, bypassed execution order, altered safeguards disabled. Each step paired with a short explanation, not technical jargon, but operational impact. No accusations, no conclusions, just clarity. Below that, embedded video clips. Short segments pulled directly from the livestream, Noah's voice, his cursor, his decisions. Context preserved, tone intact. We don't need all these paranoid checks. The system didn't argue with him. It simply placed that sentence next to the actions that followed. The second report mirrored the first, but focused on transaction-level implications. It showed how bypassed validation introduced classification drift. Not enough to break anything immediately, enough to create inconsistencies over time. The third report went further. It modeled forward, projected outcomes based on current deviation patterns, gradual risk accumulation, exposure scenarios, not catastrophic, not dramatic, just inevitable. I leaned back, letting the stillness hold. This was the design. No alarms, no forced interruptions. Because alarms can be dismissed, visibility cannot. Inside the company, nothing changed. No system downtime, no incident reports, no emergency meetings. Leland Cray would look at the dashboards and see exactly what he expected. Improved speed, stable output, no visible failures. Enough confirmation to keep moving forward. Outside the company, something else had already begun. I refreshed the partner endpoints again and noticed a response pattern I hadn't seen before. Not rejection, not escalation, delay. One partner held a confirmation queue longer than usual. Another requested additional verification metadata before processing the next batch. The third paused entirely for a single cycle. No announcements, no confrontation, just hesitation. Unease doesn't declare itself, it shifts behavior. I checked the transmission headers more closely, tracing the origin signature attached to each report. It wasn't labeled under internal audit. Not compliance, not security. A different tag. System Integrity Transparency Protocol. I almost smiled. Of course, years ago, when I wrote the external visibility layer, I knew that sending raw logs would never be enough. Data without framing gets ignored. So I built a structure that translated behavior into something partners could understand without needing to trust the company's internal narrative. Not an accusation. A mirror. The protocol wasn't designed to punish. It was designed to remove ambiguity. And now, without me there to moderate it, it was doing exactly that. I scrolled through the final section of the first report again. No recommendations, no directives, just a closing line. Observed deviations are within operational tolerance. Long-term stability dependent on behavioral consistency. Neutral, measured, unavoidable. I checked the timestamps again. All 3 reports had been delivered within a 12-minute window. No follow-up messages. No requests for acknowledgement. They didn't need to ask questions. They already had enough information to start answering their own. I closed the log view and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet in my apartment. No alerts, no calls, no visible consequences. That was the part most people misunderstood. Nothing had gone wrong, not yet. But something had changed. And once partners begin to question how a system is being run, not just whether it works, trust doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. Silently. Incrementally. Until one day there's nothing left to hold. Nothing crashed. That was the part that confused them. The morning after the reports went out, the system dashboards looked clean, almost better than usual. Throughput was up, latency down, error rates steady at levels that would satisfy any executive who only understood performance in numbers. If you walked into the operations room and glanced at the screens, you'd think Leland Cray had been right all along. And that's exactly what he believed. "If nothing's broken, ignore it," he said during the morning call. His tone clipped, confident, already moving on to the next agenda item. "We don't slow down because someone's uncomfortable with progress." No one challenged him. Not because they agreed, but because nothing visible had gone wrong. At least not in the way people are trained to recognize. I was watching from the outside, tracing the same partner endpoints, the same flow of confirmations and settlements. The system still processed transactions. Funds still moved. Reports still generated. Every surface indicator told the same story: operational, stable, efficient. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. The first sign was small enough to dismiss. A payment confirmation from one of our largest partners came in 12 minutes later than usual. Not rejected, not flagged, just delayed. 12 minutes isn't a crisis, it's a question. The second sign followed an hour later. Another partner submitted a request, not a complaint, not even a formal inquiry, just a polite note asking for a system review summary before their next processing cycle. That kind of request doesn't happen when everything feels normal. It happens when something feels slightly off, and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Inside the company, the reaction was predictable. Routine, someone labeled it in the internal thread. Client-specific variance, another added. No escalation, no urgency, just explanations layered over uncertainty. Because without a clear failure, there was nothing to fix. I leaned back, watching the pattern widen. By early afternoon, the rhythm of the system had changed, not in performance, but in behavior around it. Confirmations took longer to finalize. Verification loops extended by a few extra seconds. Approval chains added one more step than they had the day before. No alarms. No errors. Just friction, invisible to anyone looking for something dramatic. But friction is what slows momentum. And momentum was the only thing Leland cared about. He doubled down. "We're seeing improved efficiency across all metrics," he said in a follow-up message. "Stay focused. Don't overanalyze noise." Noise. That's what he called it. I opened the financial reporting layer and began mapping the transaction flow against expected revenue recognition timelines. Not the top-line numbers, the actual sequence that converts processed transactions into realized revenue. That's where it showed up. Subtle at first. A slight misalignment between processed volume and recognized income. Not a drop. Not yet. Just a shift in timing. Revenue wasn't disappearing, it was arriving later. And in systems like this, timing is everything. A delay in confirmation leads to a delay in settlement. A delay in settlement pushes recognition into the next cycle. Enough of those shifts, and suddenly your projections stop matching your reality. Still no alarms, still nothing anyone could point to and say, "That's the problem," which made it the worst kind of problem, because it gave Leland exactly what he needed to keep going. Denial. "If there was an issue, we'd see it," he said during the afternoon review. "We don't react to hypotheticals." He wasn't wrong, he just didn't understand what counted as evidence. By late afternoon, the first real pressure point surfaced, but quietly buried inside a financial summary most people wouldn't read closely. The CFO did. I saw the access logs when she pulled the report twice in under 5 minutes. That alone told me something had caught her attention. Then she opened the pipeline breakdown and paused. Because for the first time, the numbers didn't align the way they always had. Processed volume held steady. Projected revenue looked normal. But recognized revenue lagged behind. Not by much. Just enough to break the pattern. Patterns are what financial systems rely on. Break them and you don't get panic. You get concern. Measured. Controlled. Analytical concern. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that starts asking questions. I watched as she flagged the discrepancy internally. Not urgent, not escalated, just noted. But that was all it took. Because once someone in that position begins to question the pipeline, the system isn't just being observed anymore. It's being examined. And examination leads to pressure. Not from failure, from uncertainty. I closed the report view and sat there in the quiet, the same stillness from the day before, but heavier now, more defined. Nothing had crashed, nothing had broken, but the system was no longer trusted in the same way. And once trust begins to shift, everything that depends on it starts to move with it. Slowly, silently, until even the people who said ignore it have no choice left but to look. Anxiety doesn't arrive as panic. It settles in as a pattern you can't quite explain, but can't ignore anymore. By the third day, the numbers had shifted just enough to stop being a coincidence. Revenue was down 8%. Not projected revenue, not pipeline estimates. Actual recognized income over a 72-hour window. The kind of drop that doesn't trigger alarms, but quietly recalibrates every forecast tied to it. Inside the company, no one said the word problem. They said variance. They said timing. They said anything that didn't require admitting something had changed. Leland Cray stayed consistent. "This is temporary noise," he said in the executive update, his tone as controlled as ever. "We're optimizing. Short-term fluctuations are expected." Expected. That word did a lot of work for him. Because if something is expected, you don't question it. You wait. And waiting was exactly what the system no longer allowed. I tracked the same endpoints, the same flow of confirmations and settlements, but now I overlaid them with timing deviations across all partner channels. The delays weren't random anymore. They were aligning. Small pauses at key points, verification loops extending by seconds that compounded into minutes, settlement confirmations arriving just late enough to push recognition into the next cycle. Individually, nothing significant. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns, once they stabilize, don't reverse on their own. By midday, the internal communication threads began to shift in tone. Still professional, still measured. But the language changed. "Can we confirm the validation sequence on recent batches?" Not seeing errors, but timing looks off any recent changes. No action required, yet just flagging for visibility. No one accused. No one escalated. But they were starting to look at each other differently. That's how division begins, not with conflict, but with uncertainty about who's responsible. Leland responded the same way he always did. Stay focused on outputs. We don't micromanage process. Process. The thing he had spent days dismantling. I almost admired the consistency. Almost. By late afternoon, the operational teams split into two quiet camps. Those who trusted the metrics on the surface, and those who understood that metrics only tell you what already happened, not what's about to. Neither group had enough evidence to force a decision, which meant nothing changed. Except everything was already changing. I stayed out of it. No messages, no calls, no attempts to intervene. Silence at this point wasn't passive. It was strategic. Because the system was still doing its job, it was making behavior visible. And visibility given enough time creates its own pressure. The next signal came in without warning, but not without meaning. An external email. Not escalated, not marked urgent, just forwarded into the internal thread by a mid-level account manager who didn't know what to do with it. I saw the subject line through the partner feed before anyone responded. Short, clean, final. I opened the mirrored copy. "We prefer systems we can trust. Not improvise. No accusation, no negotiation. Just a statement of preference. And behind that statement, a decision already made." I leaned back, letting the words settle. Trust. Not performance. Not speed. Trust. That was the variable Leland never measured. Inside the company, the reaction fractured further. "It's just one client," someone wrote. "They didn't cancel," another added. "They're just reassessing." Reassessing. Another soft word for something harder. Because reassessment means doubt, and doubt spreads faster than failure. Leland responded an hour later. "We're not adjusting strategy based on isolated feedback. Stay the course." Stay the course. Even as the course itself was shifting beneath him, I reopened the financial layer and updated the rolling comparison. The 8% drop was holding. Not accelerating, not recovering. Stabilizing at a lower baseline. That's when control starts to slip, not when things fall apart, but when they settle into a new normal you didn't choose. The system wasn't bleeding dramatically, it was bleeding quietly, consistently, and the people inside it were starting to feel it, even if they couldn't yet define it. I closed the report and sat in the same stillness that had followed me since I left. No satisfaction, no urgency, just clarity. Because at this point, nothing needed to be pushed further. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was letting them see themselves. And once that reflection reaches the people who depend on it, control doesn't disappear all at once. It fades. Decision by decision. Delay by delay. Until the only thing left to manage is the outcome no one wants to own. Tension doesn't announce itself in a room like that. It tightens quietly, threading through conversations that sound controlled on the surface, but carry something sharper underneath. By the morning of the fourth day, legal was involved, not because something had broken, because something couldn't be explained anymore. I saw it in the access logs first. The legal team rarely touched system-level documentation unless compliance was at risk. That morning, 3 separate attorneys opened the same repository within 10 minutes. Policy files, disclosure frameworks, external reporting obligations. They weren't looking for what failed. They were trying to understand what had to be said. Inside the company, the tone shifted again, no longer just operational curiosity. Now it was procedural. What triggers disclosure in this case? Do we have a defined threshold for behavioral deviation? Is partner notification required or optional? The questions weren't loud, but they were precise. And precision in a situation like this means someone has already realized there's a problem, they're just deciding how big it is. I pulled up the same documentation they were reviewing, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it the way they would. Clean language, structured clauses, no ambiguity. If the system is operated outside certified parameters, and if that deviation impacts partner-facing processes, disclosure is not discretionary. It's required. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. That was the part most executives never fully understood. Compliance doesn't punish you for failing. It obligates you to acknowledge when you no longer meet your own standards. By mid-morning, the legal thread reached the executive level. Leland Cray joined the call. I didn't need to hear it to know how it went, but the internal summary was enough. Are we in violation? No one answered directly. Define violation, someone said instead. Careful, measured, avoiding the word that would force action. Leland didn't like careful. If there's an issue, we fix it, he said. We don't escalate hypotheticals. Still denial. But thinner now. Because legal doesn't deal in hypotheticals, they deal in obligations. I watched as they moved deeper into the framework, tracing the conditions tied to external reporting. Each clause built on the last, forming a chain that didn't rely on intent, only on behavior. And behavior at this point was documented. Not internally, externally. That was the difference. By early afternoon, the tension shifted into something more focused. They weren't asking if disclosure might be necessary. They were asking when. That's when Leland lost patience. Who approved this mechanism? The question cut through the thread, sharp and direct. Not curious, accusatory. Because now he understood that whatever this was, it wasn't something he controlled. Silence followed. Not the kind that comes from confusion, the kind that comes from recognition. Someone knew the answer. They just didn't want to be the one to say it. I leaned forward slightly, watching the thread update in real time. Finally, one of the senior attorneys responded. It's part of the external audit visibility layer. No explanation, no context, just the name. Leland replied immediately. I didn't approve that. Of course he didn't. He hadn't been there when it was built. Hadn't asked how it worked. Hadn't cared until now. Another pause. Longer this time. Then the next message appeared. It was implemented under Iris Lane's architecture. There it was. No emphasis, no commentary, just fact. I read the line once, then again, letting the weight of it settle, not emotionally, but structurally. Because that answer didn't just identify the origin, it defined the boundary. The layer wasn't an internal tool. It wasn't a temporary patch. It was part of the system's certified design, which meant it wasn't optional. It wasn't removable without consequence. And most importantly, it wasn't wrong. Leland's next response came slower. And this is compliant, a different tone now. Less force, more calculation. The attorney didn't hesitate. Yes. One word, final. Because the mechanism wasn't exposing anything incorrectly. It was reflecting what was already happening. Accurately, legally, unavoidably. That's when the shift happened. Not panic, not yet. But the seed of it. Because once something is both outside your control and fully within the rules, there's no lever left to pull. No argument to make. No override to trigger. Only outcomes. I closed the log view and sat back the quiet in the room, returning but different now. Heavier. Defined. They had reached the point where the system was no longer just an operational tool. It was a legal reality. And for the first time since this began, I knew they understood it too. Not completely, but enough. Enough to realize that whatever came next wouldn't be about fixing performance. It would be about explaining behavior. And explanations, once required, have a way of turning controlled situations into something else entirely. Something no one can contain once it starts. Shock doesn't always explode. Sometimes it lands quietly, then spreads through a room until no one can ignore it. By the time legal finished their internal review, the system wasn't just a concern anymore, it was a constraint they couldn't remove. I watched the thread update in slow intervals, each message more precise than the last. No speculation now, just confirmation. The module is licensed under Iris Lane's personal intellectual property. That line changed everything, because ownership defines control, and control at this point was exactly what they no longer had. Another message followed this one from outside counsel someone brought in, because internal teams had reached their limit. Any attempt to disable or modify the module without authorization would constitute a violation of licensing terms and potentially data integrity regulations. Not a warning, a boundary. I leaned back, letting the implications settle in layers. The system wasn't just recording behavior. It was doing so under a framework that protected its right to exist exactly as it was. They couldn't turn it off. They couldn't rewrite it. They couldn't even isolate it without risking legal exposure. Inside the company, the tone fractured completely. What are our options? Can we restrict outbound transmission? Is there any way to contain this without triggering disclosure? Questions without answers. Because for the first time, the system wasn't responding to them. They were responding to it. Leland Cray entered the thread again, and this time there was no attempt to control the narrative. Then we override it. Direct. Immediate. Desperate. The reply came quickly. That would violate both the licensing agreement and the certified audit framework. A pause. Long enough to feel. Then another message from Leland. This is unacceptable. Not strategic. Not measured. Just reaction. I could almost picture the room now, the shift in posture, the tightening around the edges of what had once been confidence. Because what they were facing wasn't failure in the traditional sense, it was exposure. And exposure doesn't negotiate. I opened the external feed again, watching the same quiet flow of data that had been there since the beginning. Nothing had accelerated. Nothing had escalated. But something had changed in the structure. A new sequence marker appeared in the report queue. Level 2. I hadn't needed to trigger it. The system had reached the threshold on its own. Level 1 had been observation clear structured, but restrained. It documented behavior and allowed partners to interpret it. Level 2 was different. It didn't just show what happened. It contextualized impact across the system. I expanded the preview, scanning the initial structure. Comparative analysis between validated and bypassed execution paths. Deviation frequency mapped against transaction categories. Risk projection tied to financial exposure timelines. Not theoretical, not speculative, modeled. And once models enter the conversation, decisions follow. Inside the company, the realization landed unevenly. At first, only legal understood it fully, then finance. Operations lagged behind, still focused on surface metrics that hadn't yet reflected the deeper shift. But Leland saw enough. What happens when that report goes out? He asked. No one answered immediately. Because the answer wasn't simple. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a breach. It was something worse. A narrative that connected behavior to consequence in a way no one could dismiss as noise. The attorney finally responded. It will provide partners with a structured assessment of operational risk based on current system usage patterns. Neutral language, but the meaning was clear. It would tell them exactly what was happening and what it would lead to. I felt the first edge of fear enter the room through the silence that followed. Not loud, not chaotic, focused. Because once you understand that something is both inevitable and out of your control, fear doesn't scatter, it concentrates. Leland tried once more. Can we delay it? Another pause. Then the answer. No. Just that. No explanation, no workaround, because there wasn't one. I closed the report preview and let the stillness return heavier, now anchored by certainty. The trap had never been about stopping them. It had always been about letting them continue long enough to define themselves in a way the system could capture without interference. And now, with Level 2 queued, and the legal boundaries locked in place, the next phase wasn't something they could argue against. It was something they would have to face. Because once the system begins to explain not just what you did, but what it means collapse doesn't start with noise. It starts with recognition. And recognition, once it takes hold, doesn't let go. Release doesn't feel like impact. It feels like inevitability finally catching up. By the time the Level 2 report was transmitted, there was no urgency left in the system, only completion. I watched the outbound queue clear in sequence. 3 partners, 3 deliveries. No delays this time, no hesitation. The system didn't wait for approval. It didn't ask for confirmation. It executed. Level 2 wasn't louder than Level 1. It was clearer. The report opened with a comparative analysis before and after. Not marketing language, not internal framing, just operational truth. Execution paths under validated conditions versus bypassed flows introduced during NOAA's changes. Stability metrics against deviation frequency. Timing alignment against revenue recognition drift. It didn't accuse anyone. It didn't need to, because the difference was undeniable. A single line positioned in the middle of the report reframed everything. Observed variance correlates with leadership-directed modification of system safeguards. Leadership-directed. Not error. Not accident. Choice. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of relief, but acknowledgement. The system had done exactly what I designed it to do. It translated behavior into consequence without distortion. Inside the company, the reaction was immediate, not in volume, in fragmentation. 2 major clients responded within the hour. No escalation calls, no negotiation, just formal notices. Contract suspension pending review. The language was controlled, professional, almost detached. But behind it, the meaning was absolute. They weren't waiting for clarification. They were stepping away from uncertainty. I tracked the financial layer as the impact began to register. Deferred revenue projections adjusted in real time. Pipeline assumptions recalculated. The quiet 8% drop from earlier didn't stabilize. It accelerated. That's the difference between concern and action. Concern slows you down. Action removes you entirely. By early afternoon, the board stepped in. Emergency review. Not labeled as such, but the access patterns told the story. Directors pulling reports directly. Audit summaries opened outside scheduled cycles. Legal correspondence flagged for executive visibility. This wasn't operational anymore. It was governance. Leland Cray tried to regain control. "This is sabotage," he said in the executive call transcript. The word hung there, heavy, misplaced. Because sabotage implies interference. And there had been none. Every change in the system had been executed internally. Every deviation recorded accurately. Every report generated within the boundaries of the framework the company itself had certified. There was nothing to dispute. Only something to face. Legal responded first. There is no evidence of unauthorized access or external manipulation. Careful wording, precise, final. Finance followed. Impact aligns with partner response to disclosed operational variance. Again, no emotion, just alignment. The board didn't argue. They didn't need to, because for them, this wasn't about who was right. It was about risk. And risk, once quantified, doesn't require belief. It requires action. I watched as control shifted in real time. Leland's messages grew shorter, less declarative, more reactive. He asked for options, for containment strategies, for ways to reframe what had already been seen. There were none, because the report hadn't introduced new information. It had organized existing reality into something undeniable. And once that happens, narrative control disappears. By late afternoon, the second client confirmed withdrawal. Not temporary, not conditional, final. The financial layer updated again. Another adjustment. Another recalibration. The system absorbing the impact the same way it absorbed everything else, quietly, precisely without resistance. I sat there watching it unfold, the same stillness from before, but now it carried something different. Completion. Because this was never about triggering collapse. It was about allowing decisions to reveal themselves, step by step, choice by choice, until the outcome no longer looked like a reaction. It looked like the only possible result. Leland tried one last time. "We can fix this," he said. But fixing implies control over the future. And at this point, the future had already been shaped by what had been made visible. The board closed the session without resolution. Not because they didn't understand what was happening, but because they understood it completely. And once understanding reaches that level, there's nothing left to debate. Only what comes next. The fall doesn't start when everything breaks. It starts when nothing can be denied anymore. Desperation rarely sounds desperate. It sounds controlled, carefully measured, like someone trying to hold on to authority that's already slipping. Leland Cray called me that evening. I let it ring once before answering. "Iris," he said, skipping formalities. "We need to talk." Silence. "Come back," he continued. "Name your price." There it was. Not an apology, not accountability. A transaction. 3 days earlier, he had erased me in a room full of people. Now he was asking me to rebuild what he broke, as if systems like reputations could be reset on command. "You don't need me," I said calmly. "You replaced me." A pause. "That was a mistake," he replied, voice tighter now. "We can correct it." Correct. As if this were a minor miscalculation. I had already seen what was happening inside the company. Legal digging deeper, finance recalculating faster, the board bypassing layers to read raw reports themselves. They weren't asking if something was wrong anymore. They were measuring how far it had spread. "Our legal team is concerned," Leland said. "This reporting mechanism, it's creating risk." "The risk isn't the system," I replied. "It's how you're running it." Silence again. Then sharper. "What do you want?" That question mattered, because it meant control had already shifted. "I want nothing from you," I said. That was the moment he didn't expect, because in his world, everything had a price, even consequences. "Our attorneys say we could lose more partners," he pressed. "This isn't sustainable." "No," I said. "It isn't. And it wasn't supposed to be." "Iris," he continued, lowering his tone, trying something different. "We can restructure your role, full control, direct line to the board, whatever you need." I let that sit. 12 years of work reduced to an offer after the system had already told its story. "You're not offering control," I said. "You're offering responsibility for something you can't control anymore." He didn't answer. Because he understood. The system wasn't waiting for permission. It was documenting outcomes. And outcomes, once visible, don't negotiate. "I can fix this," he said, quieter now. "No," I replied. "You can't." Not because he lacked ability. Because the truth had already been seen. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I already made mine," I answered. 3 days ago. Silence. Then, finally, "Where are you going?" This time I didn't hesitate. "Somewhere that values stability." Because while he was trying to contain the damage, I had already moved forward. The offer came the night I resigned. A competitor. More disciplined, less theatrical. I accepted the next morning. "You've already left," he said. Yes. Not just the company. The system he believed he controlled. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Because this call wasn't about negotiation anymore. It was about recognition. I ended it quietly. Because power doesn't shift when someone asks you to come back. It shifts when you no longer need to. A month later, nothing felt dramatic. That was the most honest part of it. There were no headlines, no public collapse, no sudden implosion anyone could point to and say, That's when everything ended. Instead, it happened the way systems fail when trust erodes quietly, consistently, without spectacle. Leland Cray was no longer CEO. The announcement came through a controlled internal memo, the kind written to sound like continuity instead of correction. Leadership transition, they called it. Strategic realignment. The language was careful, almost respectful, as if removing him required preserving the illusion that he had left by choice. He hadn't. The board replaced him after 3 consecutive weeks of partner contraction, delayed revenue recognition, and escalating disclosure obligations. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous, just a pattern no one could defend anymore. Noah Cray disappeared even faster. His access was revoked across all systems within hours of the leadership change. No explanation, no internal message, no acknowledgement of his role in what happened. One day, he was presenting optimization. The next, he was gone like a temporary variable, removed from an equation that had already been solved. The system remained stable, operational, unforgiving in its accuracy. By then, the company had lost 27% of its contract value. Not in one collapse, not through any single decision, but through a series of quiet withdrawals, delayed renewals, and cautious exits. Partners didn't leave because something broke. They left because they understood how it was being run. And once that understanding exists, it doesn't reverse. I watched it from a distance, not out of curiosity, but closure. The same partner endpoints, the same flow of data, just different outcomes now. Less volume, more hesitation. A system still functioning, but no longer trusted in the same way. Then I closed it. Because I had already moved on. My new office didn't look impressive. Smaller team, fewer screens, no staged presentations or unnecessary noise. Just people who asked the right questions before making decisions. People who understood that stability isn't a limitation, it's a responsibility. They didn't ask me to fix anything. They asked me to build. That was enough. I started with the same principles: clear validation, measured execution, systems designed not just to perform, but to reveal when something is off before it becomes irreversible. No shortcuts, no theatrics, just structure. On my first day, someone asked me why I left my previous role. I thought about it for a moment, then gave them the simplest answer I could. They stopped listening to the system. That was the truth. Not the version written in reports or summarized in board decisions. The real one. Because in the end, nothing that happened required intervention. It required exposure. And exposure, once it reaches the people who depend on the system, creates its own form of justice. Quiet, measured, final. I never needed to go back. I never needed to prove anything. The system had already done that. They thought I built a system for them. I built it so the truth would never need me. I learned something most people don't realize until it's too late. Your value isn't proven when everything works. It's revealed when someone tries to replace you without understanding what you built. I didn't fight back. I didn't argue. I let the system speak, and the truth did what anger never could. It made people see clearly. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It's patient, structured, and impossible to ignore once it unfolds. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or quietly pushed aside, remember this: what you build with integrity will always outlast the people who try to shortcut it. Now I want to ask you something. If this story made you think differently, even for a moment, don't keep it to yourself. A single like or share from you might be the reason someone else finally sees their own worth. And if you choose to subscribe, you're not just following a channel, you're helping these stories reach the people who need them most. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a situation like this? Because your voice might be the one that helps someone else stand up today. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.